Are you a fan of Creedence Clearwater Revival? They were one of the greatest bands of the 1960s and 70s whose legacy has largely been overlooked. The band consisted of many talented performers, including rhythm guitarist and vocalist Tom Fogerty. Fogerty died unexpectedly in 1990. At the time, it was widely accepted it was due to tuberculosis. But later on, we found out this wasn't the case. His untimely death is now considered one of music history's greatest tragedies. So how did Tom Fogerty pass away, and what happened to Creedence Clearwater Revival? While the New York Times published an obituary which stated tuberculosis was the cause of Tom Fogerty's death, it was later found out he had respiratory failure. This respiratory failure was due to AIDS. While we all know about this vicious disease today, it was still relatively mysterious in 1990. In the 80s, AIDS broke out, and anyone who got HIV and later AIDS was stigmatized by society. Famous entertainers were no exception. While HIV/AIDS is often attributed to promiscuous sex, Tom Fogerty got the virus through a blood transfusion from a back surgery. This was the tragedy of his death. Through no fault of his own, he succumbed to the horrors of AIDS. During the 80s, he underwent a back surgery that required a blood transfusion as part of the process. The blood hadn't been screened for HIV, and Fogerty had to live with AIDS for a few years before his death. What about Creedence Clearwater Revival? They were one of the biggest bands in their time, and their legacy seems to have been largely forgotten. Whatever happened to them? For much of the 60s, Tom Fogerty and his brother John were in a band with Doug Clifford and Stu Cook. The band tried out different names, including the Gollywogs and the Blue Velvets, before eventually settling down as Creedence Clearwater Revival. The band's unusual name came from three sources. Creedence came from one of Tom's friends. Clearwater came from a beer commercial. Revival was inspired by a statement of intent. Thus, Creedence Clearwater Revival was born. While the name seemed a mouthful, its unique name would match its unique style of music. Tom and John focused on creating songs to develop the band's signature musical style. They were inspired by Southern rock music and the styles of roots rock, blues rock, and country rock. They'd sing about the bayous and the Mississippi River, which would make any listeners think they were Southerners. Their focus was on telling stories with their songs. Like much of the music of the 60s and 70s, they were dedicated to maintaining a uniqueness to their band, in complete contrast to contemporary popular American music. Their talents would take them to many popular music concerts and festivals, including Woodstock. They also performed at the Denver Pop Festival with Jimi Hendrix and the Atlanta Pop Festival with Led Zeppelin and Joe Cocker. For much of the band's history, Tom was the frontman. In 1968, they found success and catapulted to the music scene with the release of their self-titled debut album. Their earliest hits included Proud Mary, Born on the Bayou, and Bad Moon Rising. In 1969, their song Fortunate Son hit the airwaves and became one of the most popular songs of the year. It told the story of how rich men and politicians could start wars while the poor fought in these wars. The song became an anti-war anthem for many Vietnam War protesters. To this day, it remains a great song to protest wars. In 2013, the Library of Congress selected Fortunate Son to be preserved for historical and cultural significance. And Fortunate Son was just the beginning. They were now one of America's most popular rock bands. Though they were from California, they were heavily inspired by Southern rock and had a unique musical style that made them stand out. They continued to produce a string of hits, many of which would reach towards the top of the charts. While they never reached number one in the US, they did in other countries, including the UK. And regardless of what the charts and critics said, audiences loved Creedence Clearwater Revival. But behind the scenes, things weren't quite as rosy. While Tom Fogerty had been the frontman, John began to lead the vocals as the band grew in popularity. Egos clashed and there were creative differences within the band. While this is to be expected, it stood in the way of the band playing together. Tom left the band in 1971 while they were still hugely popular. The remaining members continued as a trio before calling it quits in 1972. For the rest of his career, Tom performed as a solo artist. He had many great successes, but none ever matched the success he had with Creedence. The same went for the other band members. Even after breaking up, there was sadly some enmity among the band members. Tom was embroiled in many lawsuits with Fantasy Records, which owned the rights to Creedence Clearwater Revival's records. He wanted to make sure he would earn the royalties from their songs. But it seemed Tom wanted to put his work with CCR behind him. He would seldom sing any of the band's songs when he performed in later years. There was also little contact between Tom and the other band members. There were some exceptions, however. On Tom's third solo album, Zephyr National, there was a song called Mystic Isle Avalon that featured his former bandmates. However, John Fogerty, still at odds with his brother, recorded his portion of the song separately. The band performed together at Tom's wedding in 1980 and later performed at a school reunion. Nevertheless, it seemed as if the animosity between Tom and John wasn't going to end. In the 1980s, Tom had to undergo back surgery. Part of the surgery involved having a blood transfusion. While this likely didn't worry Tom at the time, this would lead to difficulties for the rest of his life and lead to his untimely death. HIV was not a well-known virus at the time. The AIDS crisis soared in the 1980s, and this mysterious illness was gradually becoming more public. Eventually, Tom learned he had acquired HIV/AIDS from the transfusion. This concerned him and his family, and he knew HIV/AIDS could take a toll on his well-being. It was at this time that Tom and John decided to reconcile their relationship. John spent time with Tom during the final years of his life. They put their differences aside and remembered their time together touring with Creedence. On September 6, 1990, Tom Fogerty passed away. He was 48 years old. While he had a tragic death and Creedence Clearwater Revival also had a short life, their contribution to American music was unparalleled. Looking back, one can't imagine a band of 4 California guys could produce songs inspired by Southern rock. Whether it was a cover of Screamin' Jay Hawkins' I Put a Spell on You or their classic hit Fortunate Son, their songs struck a chord with American audiences. To this day, they have many fans throughout the world. In 1993, 3 years after Tom passed away, Creedence was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The surviving band members all attended the induction ceremony. Unfortunately, when it was time to perform, John Fogerty wanted Bruce Springsteen and other musicians to perform the music. This angered Doug Clifford and Stu Cook, who left the ceremony. Another aspect of the band's tragic story included the squabbles between John, Doug, and Stu. John wanted to take center stage in decision-making, and this didn't always work well with the other bandmates. Nevertheless, they managed to make up in later years. So what do you think about Tom Fogerty and Creedence Clearwater Revival? Do you think the band gets the appreciation they deserve? Or do you think future generations might never learn to appreciate their incredible talents? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below. And before you move on, make sure to give this video a like and subscribe to Facts First if you haven't already. Click the bell icon to stay updated on all our latest content.